Somewhat recently, Johanan Raatz made a video to Know No More where he offers two of the worst arguments he's ever made. In the first argument, he says,
"Is it possible for the mind to not be fundamental, but rather emergent? Well, if we consider that emergent things are only comprised of syntactical arrangements of fundamental things, this would be a problem if we want to argue that the mind has anything more than syntax. But as we can see from Searle's Chinese room, the mind must be more than syntax, and so the mind must be fundamental."
This argument is exceedingly fallacious because it commits fallacies of begging the question all over the place. Raatz basically ported John Searle's argument from the Chinese room to his belief that the mind cannot be emergent or a property. But this transposition is utterly illicit. Searle's argument in the Chinese room was not about proving that the mind is fundamental, but about showing that simply running programs is not sufficient to think computers are intelligent or have a mind, or are conscious. Raatz begs the question by making no attempt to argue for why his transposing of Searle's argument to his claim is legitimate or doable. Raatz tells us that emergent things are only comprised of syntactical arrangements of fundamental things, but he begs the question as he does nothing to explain or argue for why emergent things can be considered to be comprised of syntactical arrangements. Indeed, this is again illicit. Consistent with Searle's argumentation, syntactical arrangements would simply mean symbol manipulation or the arrangement of words and phrases. On the face of it, it is howlingly absurd for Raatz to try to claim that emergent things are syntax. Is a house a symbolic manipulation or an arrangement of words or phrases? Of course not. Is a hurricane, which is an emergent effect, an arrangement of words or phrases, or a symbolic manipulation? This is a most absurd argument, to put it kindly, and to be even remotely generous as to even entertain such nonsense, he would have to put paid to some serious substantiation to make such a thing get off the ground. Instead, in his video, Raatz substantiates that claim with jack squat, thus fallaciously begging the question. He assumes as true what he did nothing to prove. Raatz says that as we can see from Searle's Chinese room, the mind must be more than syntax. So, again, this is nothing but question begging. No argument or explanation is given for why something having semantics means it is fundamental. He simply asserts it. Consistent with Searle's argumentation, semantics would mean that something has meaning, or some given entity can understand symbols or language rather than simply inputting and outputting information with no true or real understanding of what that information or those symbols actually mean. But Raatz's question begging of how this has any legitimacy to showing the mind is fundamental metaphysically. A tree is fundamental to some given fruit, but obviously that does not mean that a tree is fundamental to all reality. And of course, it would be utterly absurd to apply John Searle's argument to that. What? The tree is semantic because the tree understands Hebrew symbols? And the apple or fruit is syntax because there's a symbolic arrangement of words? This argument is just outstandingly bad. Johanan also graces us with another rancid argument in his video to Know No More. An argument ambitious enough to supposedly prove that atheism is itself incoherent. Considering atheism has been around for ages, that would be a masterful stroke to prove such a thing is incoherent. Of course, Raatz proceeds to fail miserably. Here is his argument.
A postulation of atheism requires consciousness. Consciousness in turn entails the hard problem and the interaction problem, which entail idealism and thus God. So, of course, atheism is incoherent. It's a kind of syntax error in consciousness. This is not to say that one cannot be an atheist and postulate premise 2. It's just to say that it is not coherent to do so.
The fatal mistake of his argument, and one that makes it massively bad, is that he confuses linguistics or speech with philosophy of mind. Just because someone postulates, or in other words, verbally avows that they are an atheist, does not at all mean that they take on the problems of consciousness. That is as absurd as someone postulating or saying that they are an American and that means they take on America's economic or military problems. That is utterly absurd, and it is hard to think anyone could even make such an argument with a straight face. And even then, ignoring the absurdity of the argument is wrong on its own terms. Some philosophers deny that there even is a hard problem of consciousness. To claim there is such a problem has to be argued for. Raatz in the video simply asserts it and thus is again guilty of fallaciously begging the question. Tracing his flawed logic, he says consciousness entails the interaction problem. Not necessarily. There is an interaction problem on substance dualism, but not property dualism. To say that as a whole, irrespective of any nuance, has to be argued for and not merely assumed. Thus, again, Raatz is begging the question. Property dualism does not have an interaction problem because it does not posit two ontologically distinct substances that are still said to interact with one another. It solves the interaction problem by positing only one substance and an ontologically distinct or different property that is an effect of that fundamental substance, which solves the interaction problem since that allows the nexus of interaction between the two to be the brain. While on substance dualism, it has no nexus of interaction because you have two ontologically distinct and therefore independent entities, and thus it is understood that there is no logical connection or linkage between the two. Therefore, neither the hard problem of consciousness nor the interaction problem entail idealism, and thus there is no entailment of God either.